Public institutions are under the spotlight this week after a killer nurse and a rapist cop were jailed within a day of one another. After Lucy Letby was jailed for life for killing 7 babies and trying to kill 6 more, NHS bosses are facing mounting pressure for failing to heed warnings from colleagues about her conduct.
And following the sentencing of Metropolitan Police Officer Adam Provan yesterday for raping 2 different women, the force is accused of missing 8 chances to catch the sex offender. Documents show he was accused of sexually touching a minor after just 3 months in the job, but bosses took no further action. Multiple accusations followed, but he managed to stay in the role for another 16 years.
So how can we trust the publicly funded institutions that are supposed to protect us? Joining us now is psychiatrist Dr Soham. Thank you so much for joining us. I read your piece this morning about the letters and the notes that Lucy Letby had in her flat or her home. And detectives did suggest that these scraps of evidence were left for police to find, as if it was a form of her wanting to be caught. But you actually disagreed with that analysis.
Yeah, that's right. Hi, David. Hi, Nicola. Thank you for having me on. So, yeah, I can understand why that might be an interesting angle to think that Lucy Letby is leaving little clues, but I don't really buy it. The reason being is because there wasn't that much that would be helpful to her in the content of the notes. There was no kind of explanation of her motivations. And most importantly, there was no kind of excuse. So if I was to leave a note that I wanted the police to find, I would plant the seeds of doubt of mental illness, for example, and there was nothing of that. So I don't think that this was something that she intentionally left to find.
That's so interesting. I also read your article. I was transfixed by it, actually. What I found really fascinating was when you went on to say there is no evidence of mental illness. You talk about this being a glimpse into her psyche. You talk about guilt and self-pity, the contradictory thoughts that she had. The bit for me was no evidence of mental illness whatsoever. So are we saying she's not a psychopath, she doesn't have schizophrenia, she's just an evil person?
The long and short of it is exactly that, David. So in my job as an expert witness, one of the things I have to do is rule out mental illness. I've assessed lots of women who have killed children, and it's usually in the context of these delusional beliefs. Clearly, that is not the case for Lucy Letby. I do think she did have some mental illness in that she had some background anxiety and depression. We know that came out from even before the court case, but I think that's a red herring because it doesn't decrease her criminal culpability. She definitely has some errant personality traits. You know, clearly she lacks empathy. Clearly she is impulsive. She doesn't care about the rights and wrongs of other people, and she's entitled. So some of those features are the same as clinical psychopaths, but I don't think she's a clinical psychopath because she doesn't have the deceit. She's not sexually promiscuous, for example. She's not she doesn't lead a parasitic lifestyle. So I don't think she has all of the features that would fit her into that category. I don't think I'd use the term evil because it's not a clinical term, but
no,
if you remove everything else, if you remove mental illness and you remove personality disorder, then I suppose that is what you're left with,
Do you think that we are guilty, certainly in the West, of over-pathologizing people who commit crimes like this? Because it's a kind of a way of us trying to reason with why they would do something like this. Well, only somebody who was mentally ill could possibly do X, Y, Z. Are we guilty of doing that, of over-pathologizing?
I think we are in some cases, and I suppose ultimately it depends on how you define mental illness, right? So if you define it as somebody doing something that's ununderstandable, that's extreme, then, you know, Lucy Letby would fit that. Paedophiles would fit that. People that commit horrific sexual offences would fit that. As a psychiatrist, my definition of mental illness is a diagnosable and potentially treatable illness, you know, like schizophrenia, like bipolar, where you have symptoms that are clear-cut. But I suppose actually the most important definition of mental illness or insanity is the legal definition for psychiatric offences like not guilty by reason of insanity. And I won't bore you through all the criteria, but the crux of the matter for that psychiatric offence is, did the person know what they're doing and did they know it was wrong? So somebody like Lucy Letby clearly knew what she was doing was wrong because she spent a lot of time and effort to try and cover up her behaviours.
You also go on to talk about the fact she lacks emotive empathy. What is the motive in her case? I was also struck by how chilling this sentence is. The pain gave her enjoyment.
Yeah, so I mean, that is the ultimate question, isn't it? That is the most important and fascinating question for Lucy Letby's case. What were her motivations? And like I said before, if we remove mental illness from the equation, then what we're left with, in my opinion, is a couple of different options. It could be that she simply enjoyed the power and the domination. So we're talking about the God complex, which I think is relevant for Harold Shipman's case. So that's one possibility. It could be that she's somehow emotionally connected to the grieving process. So we know that Lucy Letby was present when a lot of these babies died. She was around the family. And in fact, she was around the grieving process at times where it wasn't even her patient. Or it could be some sort of jealous rage towards the family.
So she
unit.
enjoyed the grieving process. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's one of the very likely motivations. I think it could be a combination of all of these things. And there's another one that I would highlight that I think's a little bit more obtuse, but I think it could be really relevant for Lucy Letby, which is I wonder if she got some pleasure in deceiving people. So she's the one that caused your baby's death, but she's also the one that offers you comfort. It's not something that you often see in killers or serial killers, but and I see it a lot of times in offenders who commit fraud. So it's not just financial; it's actually feeling morally or intellectually, sorry, not morally, but intellectually superior to be able to trick people. So I do wonder whether that's an element for Lucy Letby as well.
And for the past couple of days, we've been discussing, certainly on this show, why she didn't actually attend the sentencing on Monday and the kind of ethics around that, and the fact that killers certainly should be brought into the dock to face their victims. What can you comment on that from your professional perspective as to why she might not have attended court on Monday?
Sure, absolutely, Nicola. So I think there's two possible likely theories. One is that it was a last-ditch effort of her kind of control and power and dominance. So it's one of the only ways that she could lash out at the parents, at the process. I personally don't believe that's the case for Lucy Letby, and I'll explain why. It's because throughout the entire trial, she wasn't like smug or glib. She wasn't proud. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't, indifferent. She wasn't goading the parents. She was protesting her innocence, and she was quite emotional. So that doesn't fit in with not attending court for that reason. So I think it's simpler than that. I think it is simply cowardice. From her perspective, she almost certainly knew that she would end with a whole life order. So she knew what the outcome was going to be. So from her selfish perspective, what's the point of turning up? She's already one of the most reviled and hated people in the country. So it's just an opportunity for people to point their finger at her again and blame her again. And the other thing I was going to say is that I've also been reading about the proposed change in legislation to force defendants to come in. I've got to be honest, I've got mixed feelings about it. I can kind of understand how it might be helpful in some cases, and it might be cathartic for the victims or the families of the victims to kind of say their piece, and for the perpetrator to hear the victim impact statement. But my issue is what happens if the perpetrator doesn't play ball? What happens if they, mock or jeer or are indifferent or even, use it as an opportunity to try and protest their innocence even further? I think it could have the opposite effect for the victims. It could actually make it more stressful and less cathartic.
And just going back to the case in point, we had Stephen Brearley raising concerns, Ravi Jayaram also raising concerns, and there is a really good article this morning by Emma Jones, who's a consultant, saying those people in power ignored what was going on. The NHS has too many managers floating between various layers of management. Weaker and weaker talent fails upwards. Should she have been spotted earlier? She clearly is a very high-functioning individual. It was very difficult for people to spot this. As we heard, of course, we heard many people saying, of course, it can't be her. Not nice, Lucy.
Yeah, so absolutely. She could have been spotted before, and the complaints could and should have been taken more seriously. I think the thing about Lucy Letby that makes her quite unique and also makes the whole situation terrifying, in my opinion, is the fact that there weren't any red warning flags. There was nothing wrong with her behaviour. She wasn't antisocial. She wasn't impulsive. She was seen before the deaths occurred as actually quite a hardworking, competent nurse. So once the problems were raised, then obviously the management had a responsibility to act upon it. And I would argue that it's hard, if not impossible, to actually follow or oversee the actions of all doctors and nurses. Is just simply impractical because there's so many of them doing work all the time. So the next best thing that you can do to try and prevent something like this is to make sure that the system of whistleblowing or of raising complaints is robust. And if managers are pushing things under the carpet for whatever reason, because they're more invested in their own image than they are about patient safety, then the whole system is at risk, and the whole system will break down.
And can I just ask you quickly about Officer Proven, the Metropolitan Police officer who was sentenced for rape? He had complaints made against him for pretty much every single year of his life as a serving police officer. Psychologically, when you commit an act like that and get away with it continually for so many years, what is the impact on the person who is committing those acts and those crimes? And do they feel more emboldened to do it once more?
Absolutely. So I think there's a common thread with Lucy Letby, with Adam Provan, and even Wayne Couzens. So these are all people who had committed offences, whether it's violent or sexual offences. Something was raised by their peers and everything was ignored and quashed by the organisation. So as you say, Nicola, that's what it does. It emboldens you. It makes you think there is no accountability. It makes you overconfident. And especially in the police, not so much, I don't think, in the NHS, but if you're working in an environment of toxic masculinity where, misogyny or aggression or racism is encouraged in some police forces, not all by any means, and you add in this overconfidence and this lack of accountability, and there's no consequences or serious consequences to your actions, then yeah, you don't stop, you just keep escalating.
The GMC has obviously now got new guidelines for doctors. As you and I both know very well indeed, it's very difficult to complain about colleagues in the NHS. There is a culture of cover-up. Are you hopeful that actually that will change?
Good question. I'm hopeful, but also skeptical. So as you'll know, David, after the whole Shipman debacle, doctors were forced to do this revalidation.
Indeed.
So for the viewers that might not know, since 2012, because of on the back of what happened with Howell Shipman, every single doctor has to prove their competencies, and they have to do this through case-based discussions, work-based assessments, getting references from other doctors, etc., going through training courses. Basically, it equates to a lot more admin for the average doctor. And I would argue that I'm not sure if it's actually that helpful. So another way of thinking about it is how Shipman would have passed, I'm quite confident, all of those tests. He would have been revalidated. So I suppose my answer would be it depends what the solution is. If the solution is just more checks, more bureaucracy, more admin for all clinicians, doctors and nurses, I don't think that's going to help. It's just going to stress us out more, and we're already overworked. I think the solution has to be a bit deeper than that. It has to be about whistleblowing and allowing a culture where people who raise complaints against their peers are taken seriously, and also through an independent body. So it shouldn't be just the hospital managers who are invested in the trust that look into all these allegations. It should be somebody that doesn't have any that is completely objective, I think.
Yeah.